This next chapter is very short. It explains the situation that the Alpha Company faced when they were working what's called an AO out in the foothills of the Quang Ngai city. AO stands for Area of Operations. I mean, there are so many of these little abbreviations. Anytime you're confused, just Google it. These are very commonly used terms within the military and certainly related to this particular book. It says that they had received intelligence about NVA, which would be the North Vietnamese Army buildup in the area, and that buildup included massed artillery and Russian tanks and all new troops. I think it's interesting that no one took it seriously, including Lieutenant Cross. But as a precaution, the platoon moved only at night, staying off the main trails and observing strict field standard operating procedures. So I think it's interesting that they just kind of blow it off, but they still are taking the precautions. I mean, I suppose this would be an extreme step for the Russians to get that involved in the war. Likely at this point in time, they, the soldiers have a sense of what would be realistic and not. But it's interesting that this is the kind of rumor that's going around. So they talk about the fact that they were living the nightlife. And this is a phrase that everyone used to, talk about like having to do all of your work at night and sleep during the day. It's a language trick and made things seem tolerable because the nightlife obviously has a much better connotation in civilian life. How's the NAM treating you? One guy would ask, and the other guy would say, hey, one big party, just living the nightlife. So it's a way of diffusing the tension because it was a tense time for everybody. Sanders told this story to Tim O'Brien later, but for Rat Kiley, it ended up in Japan. The strain was too much for him. He couldn't make the adjustment. So just keep in mind that a reference to ending up in Japan is we need to know that that's where soldiers went for more significant medical treatment. If they couldn't, be tended to on the field, they were helicoptered and then sent to Japan to a safe place where there was an official hospital. During 2 weeks, so this is a 2-week period of time, the basic routine was simple. They would sleep during the day or try to sleep, which I'm sure is difficult. And then they'd put on their gear at dusk and move out in single file into the dark. It's always cloudy. There's no moon and no stars. It was the purest black you could imagine, Sanders said, the kind of clock-stopping black that God must have had in mind when he sat down to invent blackness. These are just wonderful, vivid descriptions. It made your eyeballs ache. You'd shake your head and blink, except you couldn't even tell you were blinking. The blackness didn't change. So after a while, this would start to affect you psychologically. You'd start to feel jumpy. You'd worry about getting cut off from the rest of the group because you can't see anybody. And of course, they're walking as quietly as possible. Sometimes the guys would, hang on to each other if they could, or just reach out to touch to make sure they were there. They had bad dreams. Dave Jensen popped special vitamins high in carotene, which is supposed to help for night vision. Lieutenant Cross popped no-dos, just a way to stay awake. Henry Dobbins and Norman even rigged up a safety line between them, a long piece of wire tied to their belts. The whole platoon felt the impact. But for Rat Kiley, it was different. So this is interesting because he does seem to have nerves of steel. He's the one who is crawling around in the middle of battles and, tending to the wounded and moving people out of harm's way when they're under fire. But in this situation, he can't handle it, which, I'm not judging. Fair enough. This sounds horrible. At first, he just sank into himself, not saying a word. But then later, after 5 or 6 days, it flipped the other way. And he couldn't stop talking. Wacky talk, too, talking about bugs and how, the worst thing in Vietnam was the bugs. And he becomes very obsessed about the bugs. And then it kind of gets into his imagination and he imagines bugs eating him or, destroying him, causing, constant sores and infections and things like that. And Sanders says, maybe it's because he saw too many body bags. Maybe he's had too much gore already, that this is just too much. But it could also just be too much. I think the idea of that blackness and all the things that could go through your mind would be very tormenting. He was constantly scratching himself, clawing at the bug bites. To an extent, though, everybody was feeling it. The long night marches turned their minds upside down. All the rhythms were wrong, all a lost sensation. They'd blunder through the dark, no sense of place or direction. It also was not easy hiking, like it was rugged. So not really mountains, but like there was an incline, there were gorges and deep brush and places where you could die. So there is an element of, you could die out there. So it's dangerous. Around midnight, things always got wild. And then you start to hear all the animals that are in the jungle. Tree frogs, snakes, or flying squirrels, or who knew what. Like the night had its own voice, the hum in your ears, and in the hours after midnight, you'd swear you were walking through some kind of soft, black protoplasm. Vietnam, the blood and the flesh. So it was very disturbing. It was no joke, Sanders said. The monkeys chattered, death chatter. The nights got freaky. Rat Kiley finally hit a wall. He couldn't sleep during the day because it was hot. And so like he's obviously sleep deprived, he couldn't cope with the nights. Late one afternoon, the platoon prepared for another march. He broke down in front of Mitchell Sanders, not crying, but almost crying. He said he was scared, and it wasn't normal scared. He didn't know what it was. Too long in country, maybe, or else he wasn't cut out to be a medic, which of course he is cut out to be a medic, but maybe he's not cut out for this. He always policing up the parts, he said, always plugging up the holes. So, at some point it's going to get to you, even if you're a good medic, which clearly he is. At some point, it's just like too much. He sees everybody as a potential dead body. Sometimes he'd stare at guys who were still okay, alive guys, and he'd start to picture how they would look dead, without arms or legs. It was ghoulish, he knew, but he couldn't shut off the pictures. He'd be sitting there talking with Boker or Dobbins, just marking time, and then out of nowhere, he'd find himself wondering how much the guy's head weighed. So these are very intrusive thoughts. This is very disturbing. And it would feel like he, like to pick up the head, like he imagines, putting his friends in a chopper because they've been killed. It's just horrible. Rat scratched the skin at his elbow, digging hard. His eyes were red and weary. It's not right. These pictures in my head, they won't quit, which is true. This is like crossing a line. So he goes on to sort of explain it more and more. His voice floated away. Looking at Sanders, he tried to smile. Anyway, Rat said, the days aren't so bad, but at night the pictures get to be a bitch. I start seeing my whole body, my own body, chunks of myself, my own heart, my own kidneys. It's like staring into a huge black crystal ball. One of these nights I'll be lying dead out there in the dark and nobody will find me except the bugs. So this is what is tormenting him. Mitchell Sanders nods, but he doesn't really know what to say. They sit and they watch the shadows, and then Rat shook his head. He said he'd done his best. He tried to be a decent medic. Some wins, some losses, but he tried hard. Briefly then, rambling a little, he talked about a few of the guys who were gone now, Kurt Lemon, Kiowa, Ted Lavender, how crazy it was that people who were so incredibly alive could be so incredibly dead. The whole war, he said, you know what it is? Just one big banquet. Meat, man. You and me, everybody, meat for the bugs. The next morning, he shot himself. Okay, so I just want to make a point that there are a lot of things in this book that are very triggering, that could be difficult to read for any number of people. I don't know anyone who personally, who's close to me, who shot themselves, but I just noticed when I read this, I had a hard time continuing to read. My eyes jumped right past this paragraph to this one. Nobody blamed him. So be aware of your reactions to some of the things in this book, because he doesn't shoot himself dead. He put a round through his foot. So this was mentioned earlier in the story, that sometimes soldiers would do this. They would literally injure themselves so they could go home. And that's what Rat Kiley did. So, thankfully he doesn't literally shoot himself as a suicide attempt. He shoots himself to injure himself and be able to go back home. So that's how he ends up in Japan. And nobody blamed him. Before the chopper came, there was time for goodbyes. Lieutenant Cross went over and said he'd vouched that it was an accident. Henry Dobbins and Azar gave him a stack of comic books for hospital reading. Everybody stood in a little circle, feeling bad about it, trying to cheer him up with bullshit about the great nightlife in Japan. So we're heading to the end of the book. In fact, the next chapter is the last one. So I just think it's important to sort of see the trajectory of, emotional and physical experiences that these soldiers have. Rat Kiley has been very, very brave, and, but eventually he can't be brave anymore. And so there's no shame in this, obviously. But you can imagine when you think back on Norman Boker, who, had such a difficult time reassimilating into civilian life, that, this could be something that Rat Kiley has to suffer with and sort of reconcile for himself as he returns back to the United States.